It's May 29th. We are on ice station 8. We just drilled core 13 and it was about 130 centimeters. You're gonna go inside.
The Arctic works a little bit like the ice in our cooler, and we are losing that cooling capacity with the melting ice. So when the ice is gone in your cooler, things start to heat up quickly. And that's exactly what we're facing right now.
So when I first came to Connecticut, as a brand new fresh graduate student, I was really interested in working with the carbon system and kind of how that impacted climate change and all these things. And so I found Penny, and she had a cruise planned for the Arctic. So it was kind of pulling together the chemistry I was interested in, the climate change that was happening, and just the Arctic and all the elements there all together.
It's a really exciting time to be a marine scientist, and even though some of the information can be really stressful, there's also lots of spots of optimism where you realize, like, you know, there's this problem, but because we have really innovative and talented scientists, they are figuring out a way to solve it.
If you told me in 1989 that there would be a field group of 3 women doing ice drilling in the Arctic, I would say that sounds like a great dream, but unlikely. And when we were out there, I had to pinch myself at a couple of points thinking, oh my God, I can't believe this is actually happening.
You think about surreal experiences, you just don't ever imagine yourself, oh, at 23 years old, I'm gonna be flying in a helicopter over the Arctic and watch a polar bear run underneath me. And that's unheard of.
Just thriving in that environment, so disconnected from the world that we're used to experiencing, that just becomes so special, and sort of is one of those ways that you realize your piece in this bigger puzzle.
Watching their eyes pop up and their excitement is pretty amazing, because you know you've played a small part in bringing that to them, and you know that they're never going to forget it, right? I think Lauren has a polar bear tattoo now on her arm. So these are life-changing experiences, and if you could bring that to people and to your students here at UConn, that's incredible.